I'll set a copy up, even if nobody else happened to bring one. Authors should always bring a copy of their books to the stage. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. I'm John Hilbolt, Director of Lectures and Seminars. We, of course, welcome those joining us via the Internet at our heritage.org website. Internet viewers can submit questions addressed to speaker@heritage.org, speaker@heritage.org. And those of us here in-house, including my stage guests, need to check one last time about cell phones and pagers, that they are muted and turned off as a courtesy to our guest. Hosting our program today is James Phillips. Mr. Phillips is Research Fellow for the Middle Eastern Affairs in the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute here at Heritage. He earned his BA from Brown University and his MA and MALD in International Security Studies from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He currently serves on the board of the Middle Eastern Quarterly and is a member of the Committee on the Present Danger, a bipartisan organization recently reformed to educate Americans on the threat posed by radical Islamic terrorism. Jim, I'll let you introduce the program and take the book off the stage.
Thanks, John, and welcome. 200 years ago, the fledgling American Republic was attacked repeatedly by a relentless foreign enemy. American merchant ships, having lost the protection of the British Navy, were repeatedly attacked, taken control of by pirates, and American sailors were held for ransom or sold into slavery. These attackers were the Barbary pirates. They were based along the southern shore of the Mediterranean Sea in the Arab countries, what today are Algeria, Morocco, Libya, and Tunisia. In addition to the loot stolen from the ships, the pirates were motivated by the Muslim religious doctrine of jihad, or holy war. Like today's terrorists, the Barbary pirates justified their crimes by claiming that their actions were permitted and indeed required by religious doctrine. What lessons does a war against the Barbary pirates hold for today's American policymakers who are engaged in a different war against a vaguely similar type of enemy? We are fortunate today to have with us someone who can answer that question based on his extensive research and his excellent book, Victory in Tripoli, subtitled How America's War with the Barbary Pirates Established the U.S. Navy and Shaped a Nation. Joshua London is the Deputy Director for Public Affairs with the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America. There he helps develop and coordinate public policy research and initiatives on behalf of the Orthodox Jewish community. Previously, Josh served as the Director of Policy with the Jewish Policy Center, a conservative think tank and sister organization of the Republican Jewish Coalition. Prior to his public policy activities, Josh was a journalist and remains an active freelance writer and commentator. He formerly was a senior editor with the American Spectator magazine, and he has written on politics and public policy for many publications, including the Washington Examiner, Time, the American Spectator, Human Events, National Review Online, Military.com, and Details, Promoting Jewish and Conservative Values. He's also contributed a chapter on Jewish family values to the Public Policy and Social Issues, Jewish Sources and Perspectives, published by Prager Press. Josh holds an MA in Social Science from the University of Chicago and a BA in Political Science from the University of California, Davis. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Josh.
Thank you, Jim, for the nice intro and for hosting me here today at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you all for coming. Over 2 centuries ago, the United States was dragged into the affairs of the Islamic world by an escalating series of unprovoked attacks on Americans by Muslim pirates, the terrorists of the era. These pirates preyed on unsuspecting trade ships. The lumbering merchant vessels of the time were no match for the Muslim pirate ships, which were built for speed and lightning strikes. It was simply a fact of life that, over the centuries, took its toll on countless merchant ships and their crews. Contemporary scholars estimate that over 1 million white Christians from France and Italy to Spain, Holland, Great Britain, the Americas, and even Iceland were captured between 1500 and 1800. The blood-curdling tales of brutality and horror that awaited Christians unlucky enough to fall victim to the Barbary pirates were widely known, though sometimes wildly exaggerated. The reality was often much more prosaic, although no less cruel. After seizing the cargo and scuttling the vessels, the pirates would strip the crew of anything deemed remotely valuable. The shaken, naked, terrified crewmen would then be dragged back to North Africa. There, they would be imprisoned and enslaved, or if they were lucky, ransomed back to their sovereign or the company that had chartered them. Often enough, however, the victims of these maritime hijackings would languish in fetid prisons, unsure of when or even if they would ever be redeemed. Many perished or simply disappeared in the white slave trade. The only other escape was conversion. Embracing Islam, turning Turk, instantly changed one's status and prospects. Indeed, from time to time, some of these victims would prove rather able-bodied adventurers and mercenaries, considering their national identity, their religion, and their foreskins small price to pay as compared with life as a Muslim pirate in North Africa. Known as the Barbary Pirates, these Muslim terrorists operated under the protection and sponsorship of rogue Arab states. The Barbary states, modern-day Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, are collectively known to the Arab world as the Maghreb, land of sunset, denoting Islam's territorial holdings west of Egypt. With the advance of Muhammad's armies in the Christian Levant in the 7th century, the Mediterranean was slowly transformed into the backwater frontier of the battles between Crescent and Cross. Battles raged on both land and sea, and religious piracy flourished. It was also a lucrative business, one that yielded great riches to the pirates and to the regimes that gave them refuge. In contemporary terms, this system of piracy was simply state-sponsored terrorism, an extortion racket in which the pirates and the petty North African states were all complicit, as was the Ottoman Empire, to whom 3 of the 4 states owed at least nominal allegiance. The European states took a dim view of all this, despite their own robust tradition of piracy and privateering. After all, such practices were increasingly deemed incompatible with a globalized world that was increasingly dependent on commerce over the high seas. Nonetheless, these mercantilist nations remained more or less content to pay the extortion and appease the pirates, deciding that it was cheaper and easier than trying to defeat them. Also, the stronger nations of Europe quickly realized the benefits of manipulating the pirates to stave off commercial competition. America's struggle with the terror of Muslim piracy from the Barbary states began soon after the 13 colonies declared their independence from Britain in 1776, and continued for roughly 4 decades. After the War of Independence, America lost British protection in the Mediterranean and began worrying about Barbary depredations. In very short order, the precariousness of American interests abroad was brought into sharp focus when the American merchant vessel Betsy was taken by Morocco in October 1784. Soon thereafter, 2 ships with a combined crew of 24 men fell to the pirates of Algiers. The Maria of Boston was captured on July 25, 1785, and 5 days later, the Dauphin of Philadelphia was taken. The hostage crisis was significant, and Congress became greatly alarmed. Destitute of finances and military might, however, the United States pursued a multilateral diplomatic effort at peace. Consequently, between 1785 and 1793, a total of 13 ships and 119 American sailors were taken by Algiers. Obviously, the way forward was deemed to be the pursuit of peace treaties, appeasing terror. In 1792, for instance, Congress opted for a peace treaty with Algiers that was to cost upwards of $40,000, with up to $25,000 to be paid in annual tribute. Ransoming enslaved Americans, it was thought, would cost an extra $40,000. Unsurprisingly, these terms were completely unacceptable to the pirates. Why, after all, should they settle so cheaply? The peace treaty was finally concluded with Algiers only in 1796. The terms were far from appealing. $642,500 in cash up front, followed by a pledge of expensive annual tribute and sundry naval stores. The total cost of this transaction, Congress later determined, was $992,463.25, or about $14,300,000 in today's terms. By way of comparison, the entire federal budget for fiscal year 1796 was $5.7 million. Then, as would happen over the years, the situation in Barbary changed. New rulers, new realities, new deals. President Washington warned Congress in December 1793, "If we desire to avoid insult, we must be able to repel it. If we desire to secure peace, it must be known that we are at all times ready for war." Suitably moved, the House of Representatives on March 27, 1794, passed, and the Senate later ratified, a bill that gave birth to the United States Navy. 6 ships, the USS Constitution, USS United States, USS President, USS Chesapeake, the USS Constellation, and the USS Congress, were authorized at a cost of just under $700,000. In an early example of pork barrel politics, the ships were to be built in 6 different states. As is the case today, party politics played a role in devising national defense policy. The Federalists, led by John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, were pro-Navy, while the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, were anti-Navy. The pro-Navy party wanted to punish the pirates, protect commerce, and assert American strength abroad. Their opponents preferred spending money not on ships and distant enemies, but on westward expansion. This was somewhat ironic, as Jefferson was otherwise a hawk when it came to the pirates, and had previously argued at great length for a robust naval and military response. Jefferson even envisioned at one time an international force, somewhat like what NATO is supposed to be today, that would be called into being expressly to deal with the Muslim pirates. No one ever took that idea particularly seriously. Before long, however, national politics gave Jefferson his chance for hawkishness. Soon after he became president, the situation in Barbary degenerated. President Adams, before him, had been constrained by the early peace efforts and so was forced to comply with treaty obligations. These included the establishment of American consulates in the Barbary states and sending those regimes cash, armaments, warships, and naval supplies, as well as sundry bribes. As the demands of the Barbary nations increased, the inevitability of war loomed ever larger. This was particularly so with the Regency of Tripoli. In late May 1801, Jefferson sent a squadron under Commodore Richard Dale to deal with Tripoli's ruler, Pasha Yusuf Karamanli. Attempts to pacify him with money had failed. Unbeknownst to the administration, a couple of weeks earlier, Karamanli had beaten Jefferson to the punch. On Thursday, May 14, 1801, Karamanli sent word to the American consulate that he was sending men over to chop down the American flagpole, the traditional method of declaring war in Tripoli. Congress didn't respond to Karamanli's actions until February 1802, when it empowered Jefferson to use the Navy in any way he deemed to protect the commerce and seamen of the United States against Tripolitan cruisers. Jefferson's instructions to naval officers were explicit. Quote, "To subdue, seize, and make prizes of all vessels, goods, and effects belonging to the Dey of Tripoli, and to take any measures the state of war will justify." Note here that war had not been declared. Barbary naval warfare was to prove as frustrating as the earlier diplomatic dealings with its perfidious tyrants. So frustrated was Commodore Dale that upon returning home, he resigned his commission, stating that he was glad to be rid of the burden of Barbary. Jefferson then sent another squadron under Commodore Richard Morris. This effort proved even more ineffectual, however, and Morris demonstrated a rather thorough incompetence. For his exertions, such as they were, Morris was rewarded with a court-martial, resulting in his dismissal from the United States Navy. Another squadron was dispatched under Commodore Edward Preble. Though he too would end up frustrated, the fighting officer from Maine believed naval force was the answer to Barbary maritime terrorism. His chief frustration was the loss, early in his tenure, of the USS Philadelphia under the command of Captain William Bainbridge. This blunder was compounded by the fact that Bainbridge failed to destroy his personal papers after abandoning his grounded ship in Tripoli harbor. Consequently, Yusuf Karamanli now had a magnificent warship, renamed the Gift of Allah, 307 American hostages, and invaluable intel about the American squadron and Preble's intentions. This one act, by way of parenthetical, did more than almost anything else during this conflict to lessen America's chances in the world. All of Europe looked at this and saw, the American experiment can't succeed. This is absolutely going to fall apart. And all of Barbary rightly looked at this, said, America's incompetent, doesn't stand a chance, we're doing fine, all we have to do is stay tough. While maintaining the naval blockade of Tripoli, Preble pondered two options for the Philadelphia: recapture her or destroy her. Lack of resources forced the latter. The plan called for Lieutenant Stephen Decatur's USS Intrepid, a captured enemy ketch, to sail into the harbor of Tripoli under cover and come alongside the Philadelphia, at which time men hidden below decks would swarm aboard and burn her. On the night of February 6, 1803, the Intrepid came alongside the Philadelphia. As enemy guards, suddenly suspicious, raised the alarm, Decatur yelled, "Board," and led his men onto Philadelphia's decks. American sabers and tomahawks quickly dispatched the guards. Combustibles were placed at key spots and ignited. The inferno quickly consumed the ship. Just then, the enemy's gunboats and shore batteries were beginning to respond. Waiting until all his men were safely back aboard the Intrepid, Decatur leapt into her rigging as she pulled away. The successful 20-minute mission was over, and America had a new naval hero. "The most bold and daring act of the age," said an admiring Admiral Horatio Nelson. The Pope at the time, by the way, considered this the single greatest act on behalf of Christendom against the Barbary pirates to take place for at least 2 centuries. Preble also launched several attacks against Tripoli, but to no great effect. Frustrated with the lack of positive results and the growing costs of the war, Jefferson replaced Preble with Commodore John Barron. In an historic and unconventional move, Jefferson also sent an odd, obsessed, and self-destructive man to the Mediterranean to lead what amounted to the nation's first covert operation. William Eaton, formerly America's consular agent in Tunis, had developed a pet scheme to overthrow Yusuf Karamanli. Named naval agent for the Barbary Regencies in 1804, Eaton, a veteran of the Revolutionary War and an Indian fighter, sailed with Commodore Barron's squadron to Barbary. The scheme called for Eaton finding Yusuf's exiled brother Ahmad, raising an army, marching to Derna, the second largest city in the Regency of Tripoli, and securing its harbor, then proceeding to Benghazi and Tripoli. There, the overthrown Yusuf would be replaced by the U.S.-friendly Ahmad. Eaton was able to convince Jefferson that the mission was worth a shot and that it could be done cheaply. That was more than enough for Jefferson. But almost from the moment Jefferson gave Eaton the green light, he started to have his own doubts about it. The expedition began in November 1804, when Eaton landed in Alexandria, Egypt. Accompanying him was a small detachment of the United States Marines, led by Lieutenant Neville Presley O'Bannon. Next stop, Cairo. After that, a 500-mile march westward across the desert. The newly self-appointed General Eaton was able to muster a roughly 400-man army of European mercenaries and disaffected Arab fighters. Eaton overcame odds that might have stopped a saner man. At the fortified city of Derna on April 1805, Eaton confronted a force much larger than his. His strategy was to lead a charge straight into the enemy's guns, and with the aid of U.S. Navy gunboats offshore, capture the city. The effort was a smashing success. When Eaton's Marines flew the Stars and Stripes at Derna, it was the first time a U.S. flag had been raised in conquest in a foreign land. It's specifically because of that and the valor of the Marines that we now have in the Marine Corps hymn, the line "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli." Also for military historians and Marine Corps buffs, the dress sword that Marines carry, the Mameluke sword, also stems directly from this. Ahmad Karamanli had given his own sword to Lieutenant Presley Neville O'Bannon for his bravery, and it's that sword that later served as the model for the Mameluke sword now in the dress uniform. Unknown to Eaton, however, Jefferson had authorized U.S. diplomat Tobias Lear to negotiate a peace treaty at the same time that Eaton was undertaking his daring and dangerous mission. It was the president's way of hedging his bets. Regardless of which effort proved more successful, Jefferson would be able to declare victory. Consul General Tobias Lear negotiated a peace treaty with Yusuf Karamanli. $60,000 was given for all American prisoners. U.S. forces were agreed to be withdrawn from Derna, and a secret stipulation that Pasha Karamanli would be allowed to keep his brother's family hostage, thus keeping his brother in line. The Americans were freed, peace was declared, and Ahmad Karamanli was betrayed without a moment's hesitation. Jefferson declared victory, but the peace proved rather political. The Senate ratified the Tripoli Treaty in April 1806 by a vote of 21-8. The Federalists did not manage to derail the treaty, but they did embarrass and at junctures discredit President Thomas Jefferson and forever tarnish the career of Tobias Lear. 5 years later, the now alcoholic 47-year-old William Eaton died in anonymity. For what it's worth, Tobias Lear, several years later, committed suicide. He left no note. No one particularly knows why. It's also worth noting, actually, that thanks to Jefferson and then James Madison, Jefferson's Secretary of State, Tobias Lear was employed by the federal government for the duration of his life. The piracy didn't actually end there, however. America simply chose to ignore it, more pressing matters taking center stage. Finally, in 1815, Barbary piracy once again emerged into our national priorities. The War of 1812 finally over, and the Treaty of Ghent ratified, President James Madison was finally able to concentrate on the situation at hand. Again, diplomacy had failed. Again, bribery had failed. Money was never enough. Unlike Thomas Jefferson, Madison was eager to pursue the war against the Barbary terror with real gusto. Madison secured a declaration of war from Congress and sent 2 squadrons under Commodores William Bainbridge and Stephen Decatur to deal with the Barbary tyrants. It was only fitting that it was lionized naval hero Stephen Decatur who quickly defeated the enemy's forces at sea and forced tough new treaties on American terms that spelled victory at last. This was the first time that any nation had successfully stood up to the Barbary pirates, and it was sufficient to convince the European states that, in fact, time had come for them to do something. A year later, in 1816, a combined Dutch-English fleet under Lord Exmouth brought the full weight of their military might, naval might, against Algiers, absolutely decimating the harbor fortification, totally destroying all opposition, and effectually ended piracy against most of Europe, with the exception of France and France's allies. France wasn't so eager to get involved then, and it paid the price, which eventually led in 1830 to France's invasion of Algiers. France came to stay in Algiers until they were finally kicked out in, I think it was 1962. What's particularly interesting about the Barbary regimes, and I'm just going to single out sort of one specific lesson, I think, here. There's, I think, a great many others that can be found in the book, and some of which probably suggest themselves rather immediately. But one specific aspect of it that I think is useful for us to focus on is the religious nature of these regimes. Very simply put, the Barbary pirates were committed militant Muslims who meant to do exactly what they said. Take, for example, the March 1786 meeting in London of Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Sidi Haji Abdul Rahman Aja, the Tripolitan ambassador to Britain. As American ambassadors to France and Britain, respectively, Jefferson and Adams met with Ambassador Aja to negotiate a peace treaty and protect the United States from the threat of Barbary piracy. These future United States presidents questioned the ambassador as to why his government was so hostile to the new American Republic, even though America had done nothing whatsoever to provoke any animosity. Ambassador Aja answered them, as they later reported to the Continental Congress, quote, that it was founded on the laws of their prophet, that it was written in their Quran, that all nations who should not have acknowledged their authority were sinners, that it was their right and duty to make war upon them wherever they could be found, and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners, and that every Muslim who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise. Sound familiar? Note that America's Barbary experience took place well before colonialism entered the lands of Islam, before there were any oil interests dragging the United States into the fray, and long before the founding of the State of Israel. America became entangled in the Islamic world and was dragged into a war with the Barbary states simply because of the religious obligation within Islam to bring belief to those who do not share it. This is not something limited to radical or fundamentalist Muslims. which is not to say that such obligations lead inevitably to physical conflict, at least not in principle. After all, peaceful proselytizing among various religious groups continues apace throughout the world. But within the teachings of Islam and the history of Muslims, this is a well-established militant thread. The Islamic basis for piracy in the Mediterranean was an old and established doctrine relating to the physical or armed jihad, or struggle. To Muslims in the heyday of Barbary piracy, there were, at least in principle, only two forms at play in the world: the Dar al-Islam, or the House of Islam, and the Dar al-Harb, or the House of War. The House of Islam meant Muslim governance and the unrivaled authority of the Sharia, Islam's complex system of holy laws. The House of War simply referred to everything that fell outside the House of Islam, that area of the globe not under Muslim authority where the infidel ruled. For Muslims, these two houses were perpetually at war, at least until mankind should finally embrace Allah and His teachings as revealed through His Prophet Muhammad. The point of jihad is not to convert by force, but to remove the obstacles to the infidels' conversion so that they shall either convert or become a dhimmi, a non-Muslim who accepts Islamic dominion and pays the jizya, the poll tax. It's a second-class citizenship. The goal is to bring all of the Dar al-Harb into the peace of the Dar al-Islam and to eradicate unbelief. The Quran also promises rewards to those who fight in the jihad, plunder and glory in this world and the delights of paradise in the next. Although the piratical activities of Barbary genuinely degenerated over the centuries from pure considerations of the glory of jihad to less grandiose visions of booty and state revenues, it is important to remember that the religious foundations of the institution of piracy remained absolutely central. Even after it became commonplace for the pirate captains or their crew to be renegade Europeans, it was essential that these former Christians turn Turk and convert to Islam before they could be accorded the honor of engagement in the holy war at sea. In fact, the peoples of Barbary continued to consider the pirates as holy warriors, even after the Barbary rulers began to allow clearly non-religious commitments to command their strategic use of piracy. The changes that the religious institution of piracy underwent were natural, if pathological. Just as the concept of jihad is invoked by Muslim terrorists today to legitimize suicide bombings of non-combatants for political goals, so too the holy war at sea served as the cornerstone of the Barbary state's interaction with Christendom. The Barbary pirates were not a radical or fundamentalist sect that had twisted religious doctrine for power and politics, or that came to recast aspects of their faith out of some form of insanity. They were simply a North African warrior caste involved in an armed jihad, a mainstream Muslim doctrine. This is how the Muslims understood Barbary piracy and armed jihad at the time, and indeed how the physical jihad has been understood since Muhammad first revealed it as the prophecy of Allah. Obviously, and thankfully, not every Muslim today is obligated, or feels obligated, I should say, or even really inclined to take up this jihad. Indeed, many Muslims are loath to personally embrace this physical struggle. But that does not mean they all oppose such a struggle any more than the choice of many Westerners not to join the police force or the armed services means they do not support those institutions. It is very easy to chalk it all up to regional squabbles, economic depression, racism, or post-colonial nationalistic self-determinism. Such explanations undoubtedly enter into part of the equation, and they are already part of the propaganda that clouds contemporary analysis. But as Thomas Jefferson and John Adams came to learn back in 1786, the situation becomes a lot clearer when you listen to the stated intentions and motivations of the terrorists and take them at their word. And with that, I think we'll open it up to questions.
Thanks, Josh. And I'd like to ask the first question. After that, I'll turn it over to members of the audience, and I would just ask that you identify yourself and your affiliation, or if you don't want to give affiliation, just where you're from. And that's kind of a comment and a question combined, but in recent years, piracy has flourished or has reemerged in some places around the world. Recently, there's been reports of pirates off the coast of Somalia that have attacked ships. The Straits of Malaya, from time to time, come alive with pirates and speedboats to try to board ships while they're moving. In Indochina, Southeast Asia is full of stories of pirates. I'm not sure the extent to which these pirates are motivated by an ideology as opposed to a doctrine. But in regard to a later day or latter day kind of pirate, which is some of these terrorists that we're involved in fighting now, what parallels do you see between the Barbary pirates and these new kind of pirates or terrorists, and what lessons do you think, you've spoken in general terms, but could American policymakers learn in this struggle? It's been argued that, terrorism will continue until it's been stigmatized, such as piracy was or slavery in past times. Do you think that there's a normative element here within the Islamic world that we could work with to ultimately suppress terrorism, or is this something that you see is always going to be with us? Too many questions.
I always like to start with an easy one. Let's take the questions in turn. I think there's some definite parallels to Barbary piracy and contemporary piracy, and obviously to contemporary terrorism. And I think in terms of responses of how to combat this, I don't think anything has changed. I think first and foremost, the arena in which piracy is allowed to flourish, both geographically and in policy terms, is sort of a pre-civilizational arena. It's a realm in which might makes right. And very clearly, it's might that will solve the problem, both in terms of policing the seas and in terms of sort of hunting down the pirates in the pirate lair, as it were. That's what it takes. I think that regardless, there's a sense in which regardless of their own motivations, rational actors can only behave in rational terms, right? We automatically know that if they're going to, we automatically know what sorts of things pirates are attracted to, so we know our vulnerable points. We know that pirates can't hide forever on an open sea, and that invariably they have hideouts, either that they're being helped by, some sort of local presence, whether it's an official presence, an unofficial presence. There's ways we can track these things down. We can find them. We can hunt them down. And the trick is either to incarcerate them, kill them, or simply push them out of business. Sort of branching into the larger question of what, in a normative sense, what we can do to combat this, or what we can tap into in terms of Muslim sort of cultural resources to combat this. I'd say we have a real problem on our hands. And I think that there's no sort of straightforward or simple approach to that. And I think that's largely because for all of sort of contemporary discussions about, Islam being a religion of peace, or, Islam sort of being treated as co-equal to Christianity, or what mostly exists in Europe today, sort of a post-Christian, loosely moral culture. The fact is that it's not co-equal by design. For all sorts of reasons that nobody ever pays attention to. Christianity changed an awful lot over the years, where Islam hasn't changed in the same fashion. For one thing, there's no such thing as a reformation in Islam. And so much of what laid the groundwork for what evolved into the cultures and civilizations we have today had no sort of co-equal nurturing ground culturally, theologically, or philosophically in the Muslim world. In fact, I'd say, to put it in anthropological terms, that while the West is sort of a guilt society, right, we're post-Christian in geopolitical terms, we've been graced by all sorts of forms of progress that lead to not just a hard and fast modus vivendi where we can deal with people as co-equals even if we can't stand them. We're not obligated to kill them. We're not obligated to respond to being dissed. Right? At a civilizational level, we don't have these same sorts of impulses. We've been conditioned. We're much more into guilt. Violence is always and forever a bad thing that we need to deal with and twist our souls around. To much of the rest of the world, meaning the non-West, the non-Western civilization-based cultures, like the Arabs, that doesn't exist. They're not guilt societies, they're shame societies in anthropology terms, meaning that they respond to a shame-honor nexus. Violence isn't a bad thing in and of itself. Violence is simply a part of life. What's significant is to whom is violence being committed. Right? That's all that matters. Not violence. There's a cycle of violence or that kind of stuff. That doesn't mean anything to them. The question simply is, to whom is violence being done? Violence is as legitimate as, painting one's house. It's just part of life. It's what one does. And there's times when it's perfectly, necessary. And there's times when it's an absolute obligation. Not even necessarily in theological or doctrinal terms. This is where, we can find, certainly in our own cultural history, we can find all sorts of sort of aspects of this expressing itself. Most of Shakespeare, in fact, deals with notions of honor. Most of literature involving men deals with notions of honor and how one responds to these things. It doesn't really mean anything to us anymore, for better or worse, outside of those areas in our culture where civilization has failed, right? Street culture, gang violence. Among gangs, right, to diss someone is a more than just a career move, right? that necessitates a violent response generally. Well, that's no different at an international level. It's just, fortunately, prior to the modern era, they haven't been able to destroy our skyscrapers, right? They haven't been able to strike us in that way that they now can. They've been able to take it to a whole new level. But because of this sort of civilizational, break, I guess, or barrier, I should say, between us, I don't think that there is any sort of normative, point that we can latch onto. That has to come from within Islam, and I'm not sure that there's any indication that that's going to happen anytime soon. If you ever watch Al Jazeera, for example, and you'll see periodically they'll have secularized, what we call moderate Muslims, trying to debate with, whoever, an imam of some kind, or trying to debate, basic things about how to deal with the modern world, how to cope with with what's going on overseas, and invariably the secularist, the moderate Muslim, is forced in the interview to admit that they're not a devout Muslim. To the moderate Muslim, what we call moderate Muslim, right, they think it's a matter of personal conscience and it's none of your business and it doesn't enter into anything. And the interview invariably ends right there in terms of any dialogue, because to a Muslim, there is no such thing as it being strictly personal and, you can compartmentalize it. It doesn't work that way. And so the modern world presents nothing but challenges. And to them, invariably, those Muslims that have turned moderate, invariably it means that they've given up the faith. And most Muslims would rather take, a backward, in our terms, Arab tyrant to, living in some place where there's porno shops on the corner and their kids are going to date, non-Muslims and so forth. There's just no contest. And at the moment, culturally, there is nothing organic and inherent within Islam that I think will counter that. So there's certainly, I think, nothing that we can do about that. I think the primary thing we can do is, as we did with the Barbary pirates, is use our military might strategically and intelligently to make it clear that whatever else they sort out amongst themselves, that there's a price to be paid by trying to bring it to us.
And I'd like to open up for questions now. If we have any. Okay, Joe.
I know in some of the cultures in Europe currently, they're discussing the religious aspect, but not as openly as maybe we would. So I'm gathering from what you're saying that while our president is viewing democracy, freedom, political situation as one thing, the real question we should be arguing in all of this is how do we teach religious tolerance to a Muslim? Am I on... Because obviously we're tolerating a lot of things and they can't stand our culture. But how do we teach them that we can tolerate each other to get along in this world?
And I think you've gotten sort of the crux of the matter in a sense. Long term, that question needs to be answered, right? How do we convey to them that unless they can stand to tolerate people they disagree with, there is no real future, in cultural, civilizational terms. There's no progress to be made. And that's a question that everyone's ducking for all sorts of reasons. And, I mean, a clear example is, because of the nature of the current situation in American foreign policy, we've expended blood and treasure to free Afghanistan, a state where they're about to, kill a man for converting out of Islam to become a Christian. Well, how many Americans are stopping to think, well, why did we, why are we continuing to expend blood and treasure just for them to have a state where they're killing Christians? And when you think about the specifics of that, why is it a capital offense to convert out of Islam? Right? For the rest of us, one's personal religious faith or lack of faith is strictly an individual thing. There, it's a capital offense. You can convert into Islam and you can never leave Islam. Right? To do so is culpable by death. Well, that doesn't bode entirely well for a multicultural, diverse society. And that's something that absolutely needs to be dealt with. I mean, I think we're missing all sorts of incredibly important, broader topics because of the rhetoric of our war, which I think is I'm not sure that it was ever great, and it's certainly not up to the task now. And I think that's more often, let me regroup here, that more than anything, I think, is why Americans increasingly are disillusioned with what's going on, even though Democrats don't get any traction out of that, because they're unlike the sort of the left, unlike the marginal left, or maybe the mainstream left now, most Americans don't want our country to fail, right? We're not looking for lack of victory. We want victory. If anything, the disillusionment is frustration over what's perceived to be mishandling or missteps or what have you. And the administration, and not just the administration, the hawks, right, those pushing all of this, haven't sort of reignited the rhetorical challenge. They haven't given a compelling reason why we're actually doing any of this or continuing to do any of this given situations on the ground. But, it's just like the Cold War. You cannot defeat the enemy strictly through force of arms. You have to defeat them ideologically. And we haven't begun to even have that conversation. We're still at the point where, every time anything happens, every Western leader gets up to have a photo op in some mosque and declare religion of peace, nothing going on here, everything's cool. Well, that just doesn't pass muster. And I think that's why, the things like the port deal, with Dubai erupted the way they did. I don't think that it was anything necessarily specific to do with security concerns about this company or this or that. It was simply the rhetorical term of, we all know that there's something up with the Arab world. We all know that there's problems there. Why can't we simply discuss it? And I think that was the result of that. It was a backlash. Absolutely, we should be able to have at the highest level a discussion where we simply say, look, not everything is bright on the horizon. Islam isn't what the Western apologists say it is. Notice there's no Muslim apologists saying this. It's all Westerners. The worst aspect of all this is culturally, I think we're going to defeat ourselves well before the enemy has any chance to militarily do anything significant again, I should say. So, very long-winded answer.
We have time for one more question. And let me ask it. I was intrigued by your statement that the first U.S. response to the pirates was to sign a treaty in which we paid them essentially tribute, and then only secondarily do we build the U.S. Navy, and actually spent less money on the first ships than we did in the tribute, which I think is very interesting. But how did the Marines come in here? Were the Marines pre-existing this conflict, or were they developed as a result of this conflict? Or?
Well, there's sort of two answers to that. If you're a Marine and you're into Marine folklore, the Marines have been around since before the United States Navy was actually established. To a Marine, the Marines of the Continental Navy never went away. But in real terms, it developed as nothing significant. It was simply the police force on aboard deck, and they had a handful of supportive functions. And Lieutenant Presley Neville O'Bannon and his 7 Marines surprised everyone, and in fact that's why it features so prominently in Marine Corps folklore and sort of mythology and history. And then nothing else happened for a long time. The Marines actually were mostly made up of the dregs of society. Often they were people who were choosing between, fleeing debtors, maybe committing suicide, sometimes facing jail terms, or running away and joining the Marines. And it was simply the sort of the internal principles of the Corps and the way that that's been maintained all this time that changed things. And they proved themselves at the very beginning of their inception, under the during the Barbary conflict. They proved the mettle of themselves, and they continue to do so over time. It wasn't until their activities in World War I that anyone actually paid any serious attention at a policy level. And so it wasn't until approaching World War II that the Marines were actually treated as a respectful branch, as a separate branch, and a protected branch. And since then, things have been relatively smooth because they're the first, they're the first in the battle. But yeah, it was fighting the Barbaries that gave birth to them, and that really gave them their first hero and the principles upon which they would look to and codify virtually everything about how they view their mission, their core, their duty, and so forth.
Okay. Well, at this point, I'd like to thank Josh for a great talk, very stimulating, and want to thank the audience and let you know that we will have books for sale outside in the lobby, and Josh will be signing them, ones that are actually bought, and we have food out there. So thanks for listening to this presentation. Thanks.